Welcome back. We're talking about the culture and civilization that defines China and the country's rise to economic superpower. Still with me from Beijing, Martin Jacques is the best-selling author of When China Rules the World. From New York, Stephen Orlins is president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And in Shanghai, Zhang Weiwei, professor at international relations at Fudan University. Stephen, I just want to pick up on something that Martin said before the break about how the West view of China isn't monolithic and there's lots of different views. There is a view out there that Europe kind of gets China's different economic system and political system and is much better at getting along with it than the U.S. Is that something you've seen from the business point of view?
Well, there's certainly, I think, as Martin said, it's a gross oversimplification to say there's one view in the West, there's one view in Europe, and there's one view in the United States. Certainly, the United States has a very broad range of views. If one were to engage in the oversimplification, I would say there is a view within the Beltway and a view outside the Beltway.
That's the road that goes around Washington, D.C., right?
Exactly, exactly. Now, outside the Beltway, it's kind of driven by two things: the people-to-people relationship, you know, the 15,000 Americans that go back and forth to China, or Chinese that come to America every day, and the business community that sees the China market as now very important to their bottom line. That's part of the within the Beltway view is driven by security issues. It's driven by cyber hacking. It's driven by kind of the use of Chinese laws within the Beltway believed to discriminate against U.S. and European companies. It's driven by human rights. So those views are quite different from those outside the Beltway.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Zhang Weiwei, I want you to expand on that and talk to us about how different the Chinese state is than, say, states that we are used to in the West. If you did polling, for example, the Chinese government seems very popular right now. Some liberal democracies would kill for those numbers.
Well, the key difference between the role of the state or in the eyes of the people, for the United States, the state is viewed as a necessary evil. But in the Chinese political culture, the state is viewed as a necessary virtue. That's a key difference. And it has to do with China's long history. You know, in China's long past, you have this huge population, but we have resource scarce. So somehow it's evolved a kind of tradition where you rely on a third party, relatively neutral, which is often the government, relatively neutral and strong, which can ensure fairness and justice. So, and furthermore, it's based on kind of meritocracy system. And China invented civil servant system thousands of years ago, yeah.
As every school kid in China knows, along with gunpowder and modern sailing techniques and everything. Martin Jackson, I wanted you to expand on that. You've said that there is an illusion out there that as countries modernize, they become more Western. Explain that.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically this is a Western view, although it's also got a serious echo in the developing world as well. Basically, the process of modernization is more or less synonymous with the process of westernization. Ultimately, in its purest form, the argument is that, you know, there's only one form of modernity as our destination, and that is Western-style modernity. So we're all headed in the same direction for the same destination. Now, I think this is profoundly mistaken. I think historically it was only seriously sustainable up until the middle of the 20th century, because until that point, apart from Japan, more or less every country that had successfully modernized was a Western country. But the picture changed in the second half of the 20th century as, for example, the Asian tigers like Taiwan and South Korea, and then later, you know, Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Thailand, and then, of course, absolutely crucially, China started industrializing. And then this has spread around the world. And then it becomes clear, actually, that there isn't just one modernity in the world. There are many modernities in the world, because modernity isn't just a product of competition and markets and technology. It's also, absolutely crucially, a product of history and culture, and these vary greatly. And you've only got to actually start with the first example of this, which is Japan, to see how distinctive Japanese modernity is from Western modernity. Japan has got the same kind of level of development as Western countries, but anyone who knows anything about Japan knows that the social relationships, the culture, the institutions, and indeed the politics, you know, is very different from Western modernity. So I think that actually, as the process of modernization proceeds around the world, we're presented with a very rich tapestry of diversity.
Zhang Weiwei, given that, as there are going to be different versions of modernity, are we looking at an inevitable clash between these different visions? We've seen rising powers always traditionally clash with the established power, these trap, as scholars call it. What's your view?
Well, some frictions may be inevitable, but clashes can be avoided, especially for a rising power like China, which has totally different cultural traditions from that of the West. Because in the Chinese tradition, for instance, we did not have this religious warfares in China's long history, because different religions in China are inclusive of each other and cooperate with each other and learn from each other. So the Chinese approach is, if China can bring about this to the international community, is a kind of inclusiveness, is kind of win-win mentality and ideas and approaches. Hopefully that will help build a new type of at least reforming this current world order so that it will be really beneficiary to all, win-win to all.
Stephen, in New York, the new model of major power relationships is how it's been defined to avoid this clash between rising and established powers. You're going to be hosting President Xi Jinping. He's talked a lot about that with his US counterpart, President Barack Obama. Is this what this trip's about?
Well, let me just go back for 1 second to the question of modernization and Westernization.
Sure.
The view in the West, among a lot of scholars in the United States, is when a country reaches a certain level of per capita GDP, it democratizes. It doesn't necessarily Westernize. And they point to South Korea, they point to Taiwan, they point to some of the ASEAN countries, and they talk about how they've democratized when they reach a certain level of GDP, and they've moved also to a rule of law. And that's kind of the view of some in the United States about what will happen in China, that as it reaches a certain level of GDP, we'll see more participation in the political process than exists today. The Xinqin Daguo Guanxi, the new great power relationship, is exactly what Professor Zhang is talking about, which is avoiding a rising power, in China's case, a peacefully rising power, and conflict with the status quo power, the United States. And I think that is exactly why you need to have these kinds of summits between the President of China and the President of the United States, where they get together, they clear up misunderstandings, they reach modus operandi with respect to the South China Sea, with respect to cyber hacking, with respect to a whole host of issues that the two leaders need to talk about.
Last point to Zhang Weiwei. As President Xi Jinping lands on American soil, what can that personal relationship, trying to establish, obviously, with US President Barack Obama as well, do to further this relationship? Can they regain some of the trust that may have been lost over the last few months?
Well, I think this will be a very important summit. Some people compare this to the previous summit between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. I think this is perhaps correct. In other words, the two countries are at the moment to reconfirm their vision for the future. We must find a way to have greater peaceful relations, to have a greater prosperity for the two nations, because the two nations really, the nature of this relationship affects the global interest, not only the interest of the two peoples. It's too important.
Zhang Weiwei in Shanghai. I think that's something we can all agree on. We'll have to leave it there. Martin Jacques, also thank you so much for joining us out of Beijing. Stephen Orlins out of New York. Good luck with the dinner with President Xi. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. We have all the angles of President Xi's visit covered at china.cctv-america.com. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks so much for being with us.